Get ready to have your mind blown. Did you know a queen ruled an empire for decades, all while telling the world she was married to her country? Or that a young woman with no military training led an entire army to victory based on voices she said she heard? Imagine an inventor who could have been richer than kings, but chose pigeons over patents, and a nurse who faced down generals, armed only with a lamp and data. These are the stories of individuals who didn't just break the mold, they shattered it. They walked their own paths, often alone, and in doing so changed the course of history. Were they brave? Were they eccentric? Or were they simply ahead of their time? Let's dive into the lives of history's most remarkable singles who dared to defy every expectation. Number 8. Boudica, the queen who roared for vengeance. In the middle of the 1st century, long before England was a single kingdom, the island of Britain was a patchwork of native tribes. One such tribe was the Iceni, living in an area that today we call Norfolk. Their king was a man named Prasutagus. He had made a deal with the powerful Roman Empire, which had started to conquer Britain a few years earlier. Prasutagus hoped that by cooperating with Rome, he could keep his kingdom safe and his people secure. He was a client king, meaning he ruled his own land, but owed allegiance to Rome. Prasutagus had a wife, a queen named Boudica. She was known for her striking appearance, tall, with long red hair that flowed down to her hips, a harsh voice, and a piercing gaze. She often wore a golden torque, a heavy necklace around her neck, a brightly colored tunic, and a thick cloak fastened with a brooch. She and Prasutagus had 2 daughters. Life for the Iceni, under Roman influence, was a delicate balance. Prasutagus, in an attempt to secure his family's future and maintain some Iceni autonomy after his death, made a will. In this will, he named the Roman emperor as a co-heir alongside his own 2 daughters. He likely believed this would satisfy Rome and protect his family. However, when Prasutagus died around the year 60 or 61, Roman officials had other ideas. They did not honor the king's will as he had intended. Instead of sharing power or allowing the Iceni to continue with some independence, Roman administrators decided to fully annex the kingdom. They began to treat the Iceni territory as conquered land. Roman moneylenders, who had previously lent large sums to Iceni nobles, called in their loans aggressively. Property of Iceni nobles was confiscated. Things took a brutal turn for Boudica and her daughters. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote about these events some decades later, the Romans did not respect Boudica's royal status or her grief. Boudica herself was publicly flogged, a deep humiliation for a queen. Her 2 young daughters were subjected to rape by Roman soldiers. These acts were not just personal atrocities. They were calculated insults to the Iceni people, designed to break their spirit and assert Roman dominance. But the Romans misjudged Boudica. These outrages did not break her. They ignited a firestorm of fury. Boudica was not a woman to suffer such indignities quietly. She began to speak out, rallying her people. She reminded them of their past freedom and contrasted it with their current suffering under Roman greed and cruelty. She spoke of the loss of their lands, the heavy taxes, and the brutal treatment. Her personal suffering became a symbol for the suffering of her entire tribe. Other tribes in Britain, like the Trinovantes, who lived nearby and had their own grievances against the Romans, listened. Trinovantes particularly resented the Roman colony of Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, which had been built on their land and was populated by Roman army veterans who often mistreated the locals. Soon, a massive rebellion formed, with Boudica at its head. She was not just a figurehead. She actively led the warriors. She would ride in a chariot with her daughters beside her, addressing the warriors before battle, urging them to fight for freedom and to avenge their wrongs. She told them this was not a matter of a noblewoman fighting for lost riches, but of a common person fighting for lost freedom, for her bruised body, for the outraged chastity of her daughters. She invoked D'Artaste, a British goddess of victory, calling for her aid. Timing of the revolt was advantageous for the Britons. The Roman governor of Britain, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was far away campaigning on the island of Mona, now Anglesey, in North Wales, attacking a stronghold of the Druids, who were influential religious leaders among the Britons. With the main Roman military force occupied elsewhere, Boudica's rebellion struck hard and fast. Their first target was Camulodunum. The city was poorly defended. It had no strong walls, as the Romans had not expected a major uprising in that area. The Britons swarmed the city, slaughtering the inhabitants, Roman and pro-Roman Britons alike. They showed no mercy. Houses were burned. Temples were destroyed. Temple of Claudius, a symbol of Roman imperial power and divine honor for the deceased emperor, was a particular focus of their rage. Those who sought refuge in it found themselves besieged. The temple was stormed and destroyed after 2 days. Archaeological evidence from Colchester today shows a thick layer of burnt material dating from this period, a silent testament to the city's destruction. News of the fall of Camulodunum spread panic. A small Roman legion, the Legio X Hispana, commanded by Quintus Petilius Carialis, tried to march to the city's relief, but they were ambushed by Boudica's forces and heavily defeated. Most of the Roman infantry were killed. Only the commander and some of his cavalry managed to escape. This victory further swelled the ranks of Boudica's army as more Britons, emboldened by her success, joined the rebellion. Suetonius Paulinus, the Roman governor, heard of the disaster and rushed back from Mona with a detachment of his troops. He marched towards Londinium, modern-day London, which was then a thriving commercial center. However, when Suetonius assessed the situation, he realized he did not have enough soldiers to defend Londinium against Boudica's vast army, which some ancient sources claim numbered over 100,000, though such figures are often exaggerated. Suetonius made the difficult decision to abandon Londinium to save his army and fight another day. He offered to escort any inhabitants who wished to leave with him, but many stayed behind. Boudica's forces descended upon Londinium. Like Camulodunum, it was undefended. The city was sacked and burned to the ground. Its inhabitants were massacred. Archaeological digs in London have also revealed a layer of red burnt debris, known as the Boudican destruction layer. After Londinium, the rebels turned their attention to Verulamium, modern St. Albans, another pro-Roman town. It too was destroyed, its people killed. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing over a century later, described the Britons as committing terrible atrocities, showing no interest in taking prisoners for ransom or for slavery, but only in slaughter, hanging, burning, and crucifixion. He claimed that as many as 70,000 or 80,000 Romans and their allies perished in these 3 cities. Meanwhile, Suetonius Paulinus was gathering his forces. He managed to consolidate his own legion, the Legio Ziv Gemina, parts of the Legio X Valeria Victrix, and auxiliary troops he could find. He had an army of perhaps around 10,000 men. He chose his battlefield carefully, a place with a narrow defile, protected by a forest to his rear, and an open plain in front. This terrain would prevent Boudica's much larger army from surrounding him and would force them into a frontal assault where Roman discipline and weaponing could be most effective. Boudica's army, confident after their series of victories, arrived at the battlefield. They brought with them wagons filled with their families, women and children, whom they placed at the edge of the plain, expecting to witness another great victory. Boudica, in her chariot, once again addressed her troops, urging them to fight bravely. The battle began. The Britons charged across the plain towards the Roman lines. The Romans held their ground, first unleashing a volley of javelins, called pila, which pierced the Britons' shields and bodies, disrupting their charge. Then the Romans advanced in a wedge formation, their legionaries using their short stabbing swords, the gladii, with deadly effect in close combat, while protected by their large shields and armor. The Britons, though numerous and brave, were less well-equipped and less disciplined than the Roman soldiers. Their long swords were less effective in the crush of battle. Despite their numerical superiority, the Britons could not break the Roman lines. The narrowness of the battlefield negated their advantage in numbers. As the battle wore on, the Britons began to tire. The Romans pressed their advantage, pushing the Britons back. The retreat turned into a rout. However, the Britons' escape was hampered by the line of wagons carrying their families, which blocked their path. The Roman soldiers, showing no mercy, slaughtered not only the warriors but also the women, children, and even the pack animals. Tacitus reports that some 80,000 Britons fell in the battle, while Roman losses were only around 400. What happened to Boudica after this devastating defeat is not entirely certain. Tacitus says that she poisoned herself rather than face capture by the Romans. Cassius Dio, on the other hand, suggests she fell ill and died, and was given a lavish burial. Whatever the manner of her death, her rebellion was crushed. The Romans spent the following months brutally suppressing any remaining resistance, devastating the lands of the tribes that had participated in the revolt. Suetonius Paulinus's harsh reprisals caused concern even in Rome. There was a fear that his actions would provoke further rebellion rather than secure peace. Eventually, he was replaced by a more conciliatory governor. Gradually, Roman Britain began to recover. The destroyed cities were rebuilt. Boudica, for the Romans, became a symbol of a dangerous barbarian queen. For later generations in Britain, especially during the Victorian era, when Queen Victoria was on the throne, Boudica was rediscovered and celebrated as a patriotic British heroine, a symbol of courage and the fight for freedom. Statues were erected in her honor, and her story became a popular subject for art and literature. She had been a queen, a widow, a mother, and ultimately a warrior who led one of the most significant uprisings against the might of the Roman Empire, a rebellion born from personal humiliation and a fierce desire for justice. Number 7. Hatshepsut, the woman who became king. Imagine ancient Egypt, a land of towering pyramids, mighty pharaohs, and powerful gods. For thousands of years, this civilization was ruled by kings, men who were seen as divine or semi-divine. The role of pharaoh was almost exclusively male. Women, even royal women, usually held positions like queen consort, regent for a young son, or high priestess. But around 1478, before Common Era, a woman named Hatshepsut did something extraordinary. She declared herself Pharaoh, a king of Egypt, and ruled for over 2 decades. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and his principal wife, Ahmose. This made her of pure royal blood. She was married to her half-brother, Thutmose I, which was a common practice in Egyptian royal families to keep the bloodline pure. With Thutmose I, she had a daughter named Neferyur. Thutmose I also had a son, Thutmose I, with a secondary wife named Iceni. When Thutmose I died, after a relatively short reign, his son Thutmose I, he was still a young child. Following tradition, Hatshepsut became regent for her stepson, Thutmose I. This was a conventional role for a queen dowager. As regent, she would rule in the young king's name until he was old enough to take power himself. For the first few years of Thutmose I's reign, Hatshepsut seems to have fulfilled this role. Inscriptions and monuments from this early period show her standing behind Thutmose I in the lesser position appropriate for a regent. However, Hatshepsut was ambitious and capable. She gradually began to assert more authority. By the 7th year of Thutmose I's reign, something changed. Hatshepsut took the bold and unprecedented step of having herself crowned Pharaoh of Egypt. She adopted the full royal titulary, the 5 great names that were part of a pharaoh's official identity. She was no longer just a regent ruling for a king. She was a king in her own right. Thutmose I was not deposed. He remained as a co-ruler. But Hatshepsut was clearly the senior partner, the dominant power. To legitimize her rule as a female king, Hatshepsut employed clever strategies. She emphasized her royal lineage, her direct connection to Thutmose I, who was a respected pharaoh. She also claimed divine sanction for her rule. Inscriptions and reliefs at her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri in Thebes tell a story of her divine birth. According to this narrative, the god Amun-Ra himself took the form of her father, Thutmose I, and impregnated her mother, Ahmose, thus making Hatshepsut the divine offspring of the chief god. This story directly paralleled the traditional myths of male pharaohs, divine parentage. Another way Hatshepsut solidified her pharaonic authority was through her visual representation. In statues and reliefs, she was often depicted with all the traditional symbols of a male pharaoh. She was shown wearing the royal kilt, the Nimes headdress, and even the false beard that was characteristic of Egyptian kings. Sometimes her statues had a more masculine physique. This was not necessarily an attempt to deny her femininity, but rather to fit herself into the established iconography of kingship, which was overwhelmingly male. By presenting herself in this way, she was signaling that she possessed all the powers and responsibilities of a legitimate pharaoh. There are also statues that show her in a more feminine form, indicating a complex and evolving representation. Hatshepsut's reign, which lasted for about 21 years, was largely peaceful and prosperous. Unlike many pharaohs who focused on military conquest, Hatshepsut concentrated on internal development, trade, and extensive building projects. One of her most famous achievements was her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri on the west bank of the Nile, opposite modern Luxor. This temple, called Jezero, or Holy of Holies, is a stunning example of ancient Egyptian architecture, with its terraced colonnades set against a dramatic cliff face. Temple walls are covered with reliefs depicting key events of her reign, including her divine birth and a famous trading expedition to the land of Punt. The expedition to Punt, a distant land believed to be somewhere on the coast of East Africa or Arabia, was a highlight of her rule. She sent a fleet of 5 large ships on this trading mission. The reliefs at Deir el-Bahri show the Egyptians returning with valuable goods from Punt: incense trees, myrrh and frankincense, ebony, ivory, gold, exotic animals like monkeys and giraffes, and even people from Punt. The successful expedition brought great wealth and prestige to Egypt and was celebrated as a major triumph. She had live myrrh trees planted in the courtyards of her temple. Hatshepsut also undertook numerous other building projects throughout Egypt. She restored temples that had fallen into disrepair during the Hyksos occupation of Egypt, which had ended a few generations before her time. She erected impressive obelisks at the Temple of Karnak in Thebes, the main religious center of Egypt. 2 of these obelisks were among the tallest ever quarried in Egypt, towering nearly 100 feet high. One of them still stands today at Karnak. She also commissioned many statues of herself, placing them in temples throughout the land. She often spoke of her devotion to her father Amun-Ra, crediting him with her success. Throughout her reign, Thutmose I was not entirely sidelined. He was depicted in some temple reliefs alongside Hatshepsut, albeit in a secondary role. He also led military campaigns, particularly in Nubia and Syria-Palestine, during the later part of her reign, suggesting he was gaining experience and authority. It seems they maintained a working co-regency, though the exact nature of their relationship and power dynamic is still debated by historians. There is little evidence of open conflict between them during her lifetime. Hatshepsut died around 1458 before Common Era, after ruling for more than 2 decades. She was buried in the Valley of the Kings, the traditional burial place for pharaohs. She had prepared a tomb for herself there when she was still queen, but as pharaoh, she had it enlarged or possibly commissioned a new one, fit for a king. Her father, Thutmose I's sarcophagus, was even moved into her tomb so they could lie together. After her death, Thutmose I finally became the sole ruler of Egypt. He went on to become one of Egypt's greatest military pharaohs, often called the Napoleon of Egypt for his many successful campaigns that expanded the empire. However, late in his reign, something curious happened. Monuments and inscriptions bearing Hatshepsut's name and image began to be systematically erased or altered. Her statues were smashed or buried. Her name was often replaced with that of Thutmose I, Thutmose I, or Thutmose I himself. Cartouches, a lozenge shape, enclosing a royal name that contained her name or chiseled out. The reasons for this posthumous persecution are not entirely clear. It was not a complete obliteration, as some of her monuments, particularly those in more remote locations or inside her temple at Deir el-Bahri, survive. Some scholars suggest Thutmose I may have done this to legitimize his own son's succession by erasing the precedent of a powerful female ruler, ensuring a smooth male line of inheritance. Others believe it might have been to reclaim the achievements of her reign for himself, or to reinforce the traditional male-only nature of kingship. It was not necessarily out of personal hatred, as he waited some 20 years after her death to begin these erasures. For centuries, Hatshepsut's reign was largely forgotten or misunderstood due to these attempts to remove her from the historical record. Early Egyptologists were puzzled by the evidence of a female king. It was only through careful archaeological work and the decipherment of hieroglyphs in the 19th and 20th centuries that her story was gradually pieced back together. Today, Hatshepsut is recognized as one of Egypt's most successful pharaohs, a woman who defied convention to rule as a king, ushering in an era of peace, prosperity, and remarkable artistic and architectural achievements. Her decision to rule not merely as a queen regent, but as a full pharaoh in a world dominated by male rulers remains a testament to her ambition, political skill, and determination. Number 6. Joan of Arc the Maid, who led an army. In the early 15th century, France was a kingdom in deep crisis. The 100 Years' War against England had been raging for decades, and much of northern France, including Paris, was under English control or allied with their Burgundian supporters. The French king, Charles V, was derisively called the King of Boers because his effective rule was limited to a small area in central and southern France. The morale of the French people was low. It was into this desperate situation that a young peasant girl named Jean, or Joan, emerged from a small village called Domremy. Joan was born around 1412. She was not taught to read or write, but her mother instilled in her a deep love for the Catholic faith. By her own later testimony, when she was about 13 years old, she began to experience visions and hear voices. She identified these voices as belonging to Saint Michael, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and Saint Margaret of Antioch. Initially, the voices told her to be good and go to church regularly. But as she grew older, and as the situation in France became more dire, the messages became more specific and urgent. The voices told her that she, Joan, was chosen by God to save France. They instructed her to drive the English out of France and to see the Dauphin Charles crowned as the rightful king in Reims Cathedral, the traditional site for French coronations. Imagine a young, uneducated peasant girl claiming to have such a divine mission. In that era, society was rigidly hierarchical, and women, especially peasant women, had very limited roles. For Joan to undertake such a task was almost unthinkable. Yet, she was persistent. Around the age of 16 or 17 in 1428, she approached Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of the royal garrison in the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, asking for an escort to take her to the Dauphin Charles at his court in Chinon. Baudricourt, not surprisingly, dismissed her, reportedly suggesting she be taken back to her father and given a spanking. Joan, however, was undeterred. She returned to Vaucouleurs several months later, in early 1429. This time, she gained a small following of people who believed in her mission, partly due to her accurate prediction of a French defeat near Orleans. Her conviction and piety began to impress some of Baudricourt's soldiers. Eventually, Baudricourt relented and agreed to provide her with an escort of several men-at-arms. Before setting out for Chinon, Joan cut her hair short and dressed in men's clothing. She would continue to wear men's attire for much of her public life, a decision that was practical for traveling and living among soldiers, but also highly unconventional and would later be used against her. The journey to Chinon, through territory largely controlled by the English and Burgundians, was dangerous and took 11 days. When Joan finally arrived at the Dauphin's court, she faced skepticism. Charles, to test her, reportedly disguised himself among his courtiers. According to legend, Joan, despite never having seen him before, immediately identified him. She then spoke to him privately, revealing things that convinced him of her divine inspiration. Some say it was a secret known only to Charles and God. Charles was cautious. He had Joan examined by a panel of theologians at Poitiers. They questioned her extensively about her visions and her faith. After several weeks, the theologians found nothing heretical in her claims and advised Charles that, given the desperate state of France, her help might indeed be from God and should not be dismissed. Charles decided to take a chance on this extraordinary young woman. He provided her with a suit of white armor, a banner bearing the names Jesus and Mary and an image of God the Father with angels, and placed her at the head of an army. Her first major test was the city of Orleans, which had been under siege by the English for months. Its fall would have been a catastrophic blow to the French cause. Joan, full of confidence and religious fervor, arrived at Orleans in late April 1429. She did not act as a traditional military commander, planning intricate strategies. Instead, she inspired the demoralized French troops with her courage and her unwavering belief in victory. She would ride at the front, carrying her banner, urging the soldiers to fight. She also sent defiant messages to the English commanders demanding they leave France. The French soldiers, inspired by Joan's presence, launched a series of attacks on the English siege forts surrounding Orleans. Joan herself participated in the fighting and was wounded in the shoulder by an arrow during an assault on a key English fortification, the Tourelle. Despite her injury, she returned to the battlefield to rally the troops for a final successful assault. Within days of her arrival, the English, disheartened and beaten, lifted the siege of Orleans on May 8, 1429. This was a stunning victory, a major turning point in the 100 Years' War, and it seemed to confirm Joan's divine mission. She became known as La Pucelle d'Orléans, the Maid of Orleans. After Orleans, Joan urged Charles to march to Reims for his coronation. This was a bold move, as Reims lay deep in enemy-held territory. However, buoyed by the victory at Orleans and Joan's continued presence, the French army advanced, capturing several English-held towns along the way, often with little resistance as Joan's reputation preceded them. On July 17, 1429, Charles V was crowned King of France in Reims Cathedral, with Joan standing beside him, her banner in hand. This coronation was a hugely significant symbolic victory, legitimizing Charles's kingship in the eyes of many. Joan's military successes continued for a while. However, an attempt to retake Paris in September 1429 failed, and Joan was wounded again, this time in the leg. The royal court began to be divided about the war strategy. Some advisors favored diplomacy and negotiation with the Burgundians, while Joan advocated for continued military action to drive the English out completely. Her influence at court seemed to wane somewhat. In the spring of 1430, Joan went to the aid of the town of Compiègne, which was besieged by Burgundian forces. During a skirmish outside the town on May 23, 1430, she was unhorsed and captured by Burgundian soldiers. Despite her service to King Charles V, no immediate large-scale efforts were made by the French court to ransom her. The Burgundians eventually sold her to their allies, the English, for a large sum of money. The English were eager to discredit Joan and, by extension, King Charles VI, whose coronation she had engineered. They decided to put her on trial for heresy and witchcraft. Trial was conducted by an ecclesiastical court composed of pro-English French clergy, headed by Bishop Pierre Cauchon of Beauvais, a staunch supporter of the English cause. The trial began in Rouen in early 1431. Joan, still only about 19 years old, faced a panel of learned theologians and lawyers. Without any legal counsel of her own, trial records, which still exist, show her to be remarkably intelligent, courageous, and witty in her responses, often outmaneuvering her interrogators, despite her lack of education. She steadfastly maintained that her voices were from God, and that she had done God's will. One of the main charges against her was that of wearing men's clothing, which was considered an abomination and a defiance of church law. She was also accused of heresy for claiming direct revelation from God, bypassing the authority of the church. For months, she endured questioning, imprisonment in harsh conditions, and threats of torture. In May 1431, under immense pressure and possibly fearing for her life, Joan signed a document of adjuration, a confession of her alleged errors, in which she agreed to renounce her visions and to stop wearing men's clothing. Her death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. However, a few days later, she was found to be wearing men's clothing again. Her reasons for doing so are debated. Some accounts say she was tricked or forced, others that she defiantly resumed male attire as a sign that she stood by her voices. Whatever the reason, this relapse into heresy sealed her fate. The court declared her a relapsed heretic. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was taken to the marketplace in Rouen and burned at the stake. She was about 19 years old. Eyewitness accounts say she faced her death with courage, asking for a cross to be held before her and calling on the name of Jesus. Her ashes were reportedly gathered and thrown into the Seine River to prevent any veneration of her remains as relics. Joan's story did not end with her death. The 100 Years' War continued for another 2 decades. But the tide had turned in France's favor, partly thanks to the momentum she had created. King Charles VI eventually succeeded in driving the English out of most of France. About 20 years after her execution in 1450, Charles V ordered an investigation into Joan's trial. A formal retrial, or nullification trial, was held between 1455 and 1456, initiated by Joan's mother, Isabel Romay, and authorized by the Pope. This new court examined the original trial proceedings and found them to be flawed and unjust. Joan was officially declared innocent of all charges and recognized as a martyr. Centuries later, Joan of Arc became a powerful national symbol in France, revered for her courage, faith, and patriotism. In 1909, she was beatified by the Catholic Church, and in 1920, she was canonized as a saint. A peasant girl who heard voices, wore men's clothes, led an army, and crowned a king, all before being executed at 19, remains one of history's most extraordinary and enigmatic figures, a testament to conviction in the face of overwhelming odds. Number 5. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen wedded to her kingdom. In the 16th century, Europe was a world where kings ruled and queens were primarily expected to marry, produce heirs, and support their husbands. A woman ruling in her own right was rare and often viewed with skepticism or hostility. It was generally believed that women were unsuited for the rigors of governance. Yet, Elizabeth I of England not only ruled as queen regnant for over 44 years, but did so as an unmarried woman, skillfully navigating treacherous political and religious waters and leaving an indelible mark on her nation. Elizabeth was born on September 7th, 1533, the daughter of King Henry Thick and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Her birth was a disappointment to Henry, who desperately wanted a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. When Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old, her mother Anne Boleyn was accused of treason and adultery and executed. Elizabeth was declared illegitimate, removed from the line of succession, and largely ignored by her father for many years. Her childhood was turbulent, marked by changes in stepmothers and shifts in political favor. Despite these challenges, she received an excellent education, becoming fluent in several languages, including Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, and proving herself to be intelligent and astute. After Henry VI's death, her younger half-brother, Edward VI, became king. He was a devout Protestant. After his early death, her older half-sister Mary I, a staunch Catholic, ascended the throne. Mary's reign was difficult for Elizabeth. As a Protestant and Mary's heir presumptive, Mary had no children, Elizabeth was viewed with suspicion. She was even imprisoned in the Tower of London for a time, accused of involvement in a rebellion against Mary. Elizabeth learned valuable lessons in caution, dissimulation, and political survival during these years. When Mary I died in November 1558, Elizabeth became Queen of England at the age of 25. England was in a precarious state. It was religiously divided between Catholics and Protestants, financially strained, and had recently lost Calais, its last possession on the French mainland. Many doubted whether a young, unmarried woman could effectively govern such a troubled kingdom. One of the most pressing issues facing the new queen was the question of her marriage. Her counselors, Parliament, and the public all expected her to marry quickly. A royal marriage was seen as essential for several reasons: to produce an heir, to secure the succession and prevent potential civil war, to forge a useful foreign alliance, and because it was widely believed that a woman needed a husband to help her rule. The pressure on Elizabeth to marry was immense and continuous throughout much of her reign. Numerous suitors, both domestic and foreign, were proposed. These included King Philip II of Spain, her former brother-in-law, widower of Mary I, Archdukes Charles and Ferdinand of Austria, King Eric Ziv of Sweden, the Duke of Anjou, later King Henry I of France, and an English nobleman, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, who was a childhood friend and widely believed to be Elizabeth's true love. Each potential match had its own political advantages and disadvantages. A foreign Catholic prince might drag England into European conflicts or try to restore Catholicism. A foreign Protestant prince might also involve England in continental wars. Marrying an English nobleman could create jealousy and factionalism among the aristocracy. Elizabeth handled the marriage question with remarkable skill and ambiguity. She engaged in prolonged marriage negotiations with various suitors, using them as a tool of diplomacy to play different European powers against each other, without ever committing herself. She kept everyone guessing. She famously told Parliament that she was already married to her Kingdom of England. She cultivated the image of the Virgin Queen, devoted entirely to her people and her country. This image became a powerful part of her personal mythology and a source of her popularity. In matters of religion, Elizabeth sought a compromise. Her religious settlement of 1559 aimed to create a moderate Protestant Church of England that would be acceptable to the majority of her subjects. The Act of Supremacy re-established the monarch as the supreme governor of the Church of England, rather than supreme head. A subtle change to appease those who felt a woman could not be head of the Church. Act of Uniformity established a Book of Common Prayer which blended some traditional Catholic elements with Protestant theology. While this settlement did not satisfy extreme Catholics or radical Protestants, Puritans, it provided a degree of religious stability for much of her reign, though challenges and plots from both sides continued. Elizabeth proved to be a shrewd and decisive ruler. She chose capable advisors, such as William Cecil, Lord Burghley, and Sir Francis Walsingham, though she always made it clear that she was the one in ultimate control. She was known for her cautious and pragmatic approach to policy, her frugality in financial matters, and her ability to inspire loyalty and devotion. She was also a gifted orator. Her speeches, such as the one to her troops at Tilbury in 1588, as the Spanish Armada approached, were masterpieces of rhetoric, rallying her people and expressing her determination. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she declared, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." One of the most significant challenges of her reign was Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was Elizabeth's Catholic cousin, and in the eyes of many Catholics, the rightful heir to the English throne, as Elizabeth had been declared illegitimate by Henry VI. After Mary was forced to abdicate the Scottish throne and fled to England in 1568, she became a focal point for numerous Catholic plots against Elizabeth. For nearly 20 years, Elizabeth kept Mary under house arrest. It was a difficult situation. Executing a fellow queen and relative was a dangerous precedent, but Mary's continued presence threatened Elizabeth's life and the stability of her kingdom. Finally, after conclusive evidence emerged of Mary's involvement in the Babington plot to assassinate Elizabeth, Elizabeth reluctantly signed Mary's death warrant. Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed in 1587. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, outraged Catholic Europe, particularly King Philip II of Spain. This, combined with English support for Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, then under Spanish rule, and English privateering against Spanish treasure ships, led Philip to launch the Spanish Armada in 1588. The Armada was a massive fleet intended to invade England, overthrow Elizabeth, and restore Catholicism. Its defeat by the English navy, aided by storms, the Protestant wind, was a resounding victory for England and a defining moment of Elizabeth's reign. It boosted English national pride and enhanced Elizabeth's reputation as a powerful and successful monarch. Elizabeth's reign, often called the Elizabethan era, was also a golden age of English culture. It saw the flourishing of literature, with writers like William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser. Exploration and overseas trade expanded, with figures like Sir Francis Drake circumnavigating the globe. England grew in confidence and stature on the world stage. Despite her many triumphs, Elizabeth's later years were marked by some difficulties, including economic problems, ongoing war with Spain, and concerns about the succession as she remained unmarried and childless. She became increasingly isolated and melancholic. However, she retained the affection of many of her people. Queen Elizabeth I died on March 24, 1603, at Richmond Palace after a reign of 44 years and 127 days. She was nearly 70 years old. As she had no direct heirs, she was succeeded by James VI of Scotland, the Protestant son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who became James I of England, thus uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. Elizabeth I's decision to remain single was a radical departure from the norms of her time. It was a personal choice that became a powerful political statement. She defied the expectation that a queen must marry and proved that a woman could rule effectively on her own. She navigated a treacherous political landscape, maintained national unity in the face of religious divisions, defeated foreign threats, and presided over a cultural renaissance. Her long and successful reign demonstrated that a queen's strength did not depend on a king beside her, but on her own wisdom, courage, and dedication to her people. She left a legacy as one of England's greatest monarchs. Number 4. Christina of Sweden, the Queen who walked away. In the 17th century, Sweden was a major European power, a staunchly Lutheran Protestant kingdom that had played a significant role in the 30 Years' War. Its throne was occupied by the Vasa dynasty. Into this world, in 1626, was born Christina, the only surviving legitimate child of King Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, a great military hero, and his wife Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg. King Gustavus Adolphus had made provisions for Christina to inherit the throne if he had no male heirs. When he was killed in battle at Lutzen in 1632, Christina became Queen of Sweden at the age of 6. A regency council, led by the highly capable Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna, governed the country during her minority. Her father had also stipulated that Christina should receive an education fit for a prince, not a princess. Consequently, she was tutored in languages, philosophy, history, theology, and even military strategy. She proved to be an exceptionally intelligent and precocious student, mastering multiple languages and developing a keen interest in intellectual pursuits. Christina came of age and officially began her personal rule in 1644, at the age of 18. She was a young queen in a powerful nation, and much was expected of her. One of the primary expectations was that she would marry and produce an heir to continue the Vasa dynasty and secure Sweden's future. Her cousin, Charles Gustav of Palatinate Smybrucken, later King Charles X Gustav, was considered a suitable candidate, and there was considerable pressure on her to marry him. However, Christina had no inclination to marry. She famously declared that she could not bring herself to marry, stating, "I would rather die than be yoked to anyone." She resisted all pressure, both domestic and foreign, to take a husband. She was highly independent and valued her intellectual freedom. She seemed to view marriage as a constraint that would subordinate her to a husband and limit her ability to pursue her own interests. She did, however, ensure the succession by persuading the Swedish Riksdag, the parliament, to recognize her cousin Charles Gustav as her heir presumptive in 1649. Christina's court in Stockholm became a renowned center of learning and culture. She invited scholars, philosophers, artists, and musicians from all over Europe. One of the most famous figures she brought to Sweden was the French philosopher René Descartes, whom she invited in 1649 to tutor her in philosophy and help establish an Academy of Sciences. Descartes, accustomed to a milder climate, reportedly found the harsh Swedish winter and the Queen's early morning study schedule — she often wanted lessons at 5 challenging, he contracted pneumonia and died in Stockholm in 1650. Christina also amassed a large collection of books, manuscripts, paintings, and sculptures, making Stockholm a Minerva of the North. Despite her intellectual pursuits, Christina's reign was not without political challenges. The 30 Years' War ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, from which Sweden emerged as a significant beneficiary, gaining territory and influence. However, the war had been costly, and there was discontent within Sweden over taxation and the distribution of crown lands. Christina herself was known for her extravagant spending on art and culture, which further strained the state finances. She also faced some opposition from conservative elements within the Swedish nobility and clergy, who were wary of her unconventional behavior and foreign influences at court. She often dressed in masculine style, clothing was an accomplished horsewoman and hunter, and generally flouted traditional feminine norms. As the years went on, Christina grew increasingly weary of the burdens of rule. She was drawn to the culture and intellectual climate of Southern Europe, particularly Rome. More significantly, she developed a secret interest in Catholicism. This was a momentous and dangerous inclination, as Sweden was a fiercely Protestant country, and conversion to Catholicism was illegal and would mean forfeiting the throne. She began to correspond secretly with Jesuits and other Catholic figures. In 1651, Christina first announced her intention to abdicate, citing her health and the pressures of government. She was persuaded to reconsider. However, her resolve to step down remained. On June 6, 1654, at Uppsala Castle, Queen Christina of Sweden formally abdicated her throne in favor of her cousin Charles X, Gustav. She was 27 years old. Her abdication speech emphasized her desire for a more private life. She left Sweden shortly thereafter, famously disguising herself as a man to travel more easily through Danish territory, with whom Sweden was often at odds. After leaving Sweden, Christina traveled through Europe. In Brussels, in December 1654, she secretly converted to Catholicism. Her public and formal conversion took place in Innsbruck, Austria, in November 1655, an event that caused a sensation throughout Europe. Protestants were shocked and dismayed by the abdication and conversion of the queen of a leading Protestant power. Catholics, on the other hand, celebrated it as a great triumph for their faith. Christina eventually settled in Rome in 1655, where she was welcomed by Pope Alexander VI and the Roman nobility. She established a prominent salon, becoming a major figure in Rome's cultural and intellectual life. She continued to patronize artists, musicians, and writers, and built up a significant art collection. She lived in various palaces, including the Palazzo Farnese, and later the Palazzo Riario, now Palazzo Corsini. Her household was often unconventional, and she maintained a high degree of personal freedom, sometimes scandalizing Roman society with her behavior and her outspokenness. She continued to dress in a somewhat masculine style and asserted her royal prerogatives even though she no longer held the throne. Quote, "Her life in Rome was not without political intrigue. In 1656–1657, she became involved in a scheme with the French chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, to become Queen of Naples, which was then under Spanish rule. Plan ultimately failed. This period also saw one of the most controversial episodes of her life, the execution of her master of the horse, Marquis Gian Rinaldo Monaldeschi, in 1657 at the Palace of Fontainebleau in France, where she was a guest of King Louis XVI. Christina accused Monaldeschi of treason or betrayal, the exact reasons remain somewhat obscure, and ordered him to be killed by her own servants. This act, carried out by a former queen without a kingdom, on foreign soil and without due legal process, caused outrage and damaged her reputation, though she defended it as her right as a sovereign to dispense justice within her own household. Despite such incidents, Christina remained a significant and often respected figure in Rome for the rest of her life. She played a role in papal politics, advocating for tolerance and opposing persecution, for instance, speaking out against the persecution of Jews in Rome and Huguenots in France after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. She founded the Accademia dell'Arcadia, a literary academy in Rome. She continued her intellectual pursuits, correspondence with scholars, and her patronage of the arts. Christina never married and had no children. She had expressed a lifelong aversion to marriage. Her personal relationships, particularly her close friendships with certain women, like Eva Spare, and men like Cardinal Decio Azzolino, who became her closest confidant and heir, have been the subject of much speculation, but her private life remains somewhat enigmatic. Christina of Sweden died in Rome on April 19, 1689, at the age of 62. She was given a grand funeral and, unusually for a woman and a non-reigning monarch, was buried in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, a testament to her unique status and her significance to the Catholic Church. She left her extensive art collection and library to Cardinal Azzolino, who died shortly after her, leading to its eventual dispersal. Christina's life was one of bold choices and defiance of convention. She was a highly intelligent and educated woman who found the traditional roles for queens, and perhaps for women in general, too restrictive. She chose intellectual and personal freedom over a crown and a conventional marriage. Her abdication, her conversion to Catholicism, and her unconventional lifestyle in Rome made her one of the most talked about and controversial figures of her era. She remains a fascinating example of a monarch who valued her independence and intellectual pursuits above all else, and who dared to walk away from a throne to live life on her own terms. Number 3. Susan B. Anthony, the woman who dared to vote. In the 19th century United States, women lived under numerous legal and social restrictions. They could not vote, hold public office, serve on juries, or, in most cases, own property in their own name, if married. Their educational and professional opportunities were severely limited. It was a world where men dominated public life, and women were largely confined to the private sphere of home and family. Susan Brownell Anthony was one of the most prominent and tireless figures who challenged these conventions, dedicating her life to the fight for women's rights, particularly the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony was born on February 15, 1820, in Adams, Massachusetts, into a Quaker family. Quakers, or the Society of Friends, held more egalitarian views than many other religious groups of the time. They believed in the spiritual equality of men and women were often active as ministers and speakers within the Quaker community. Her family was also deeply involved in social reform movements, particularly abolitionism, the movement to end slavery. This upbringing instilled in Susan a strong sense of justice and a commitment to activism from an early age. She received a good education for a girl of her time, attending a Quaker boarding school. As a young woman, Anthony worked as a teacher for about 15 years, one of the few professions open to educated women. She became involved in the temperance movement, which sought to ban or limit alcohol consumption, and the abolitionist movement. However, she often found her efforts frustrated by the fact that, as a woman, she was not allowed to speak at rallies or conventions if men were present or her opinions were not taken seriously. This experience highlighted for her the critical importance of women having a political voice. In 1851, Susan B. Anthony met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, another leading figure in the early women's rights movement. This meeting marked the beginning of a lifelong friendship and a powerful partnership that would shape the course of the suffrage movement in the United States. Stanton, a brilliant writer and thinker, was often tied down by her duties as a wife and mother of a large family. Anthony, who never married, had the freedom to travel, speak, and organize extensively. They complemented each other perfectly. Stanton often provided the words and ideas, while Anthony delivered the speeches, organized the campaigns, and dealt with the often hostile public reaction. Anthony once said of their partnership, "I forged the thunderbolts, she fired them." Anthony became convinced that the right to vote suffrage was the cornerstone of all other rights for women. Without the ballot, women would remain second-class citizens, unable to influence the laws that governed their lives. From the 1850s until her death, she campaigned relentlessly for women's suffrage. She traveled across the country giving speeches, organizing petitions, and lobbying state legislatures and Congress. Her work was often met with ridicule, hostility, and even violence. She was caricatured in newspapers, heckled at meetings, and sometimes threatened, but she was undeterred. During the Civil War, 1861–1865, Anthony and Stanton focused their efforts on the abolition of slavery, co-founding the Woman's Loyal National League, which collected hundreds of thousands of signatures on petition supporting the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery. After the war, however, a major split occurred within the reform movements. The 14th and 15th Amendments were proposed, granting citizenship and suffrage to African American men, but not to women of any race. Anthony and Stanton were deeply disappointed and angered by this exclusion. They felt betrayed by some of their former abolitionist allies, who argued that it was the Negro's hour, and that women's suffrage would have to wait. Anthony and Stanton insisted that suffrage should be universal for both African Americans and women. This disagreement led to a division in the women's suffrage movement. In 1869, Anthony and Stanton founded the National Woman Suffrage Association, NASA, which focused on achieving a federal constitutional amendment for women's suffrage and also addressed other women's rights issues, such as divorce reform and equal pay. Another organization, the American Woman Suffrage Association, WASA, led by Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, focused primarily on achieving suffrage state by state. Anthony also co-founded and published a newspaper called The Revolution from 1868 to 1870 with the motto, "Men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less." The newspaper advocated for women's suffrage, equal pay, property rights for women, and other reforms. It was a radical voice for its time. One of the most famous acts of defiance in Susan B. Anthony's long career occurred in 1872. Believing that the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, implicitly gave women the right to vote as citizens, Anthony decided to test this interpretation. On November 5, 1872, in the presidential election, Susan B. Anthony, along with a group of other women, registered and cast her ballot in Rochester, New York. 2 weeks later, she was arrested for illegally voting. Her trial, United States v. Susan B. Anthony, took place in June 1873. It was a highly publicized event. Before the trial, Anthony traveled throughout Monroe County, New York, giving a powerful speech titled, "Is it a crime for a citizen of the United States to vote?" in which she argued passionately for her constitutional right to vote. At the trial, the Judge Ward Hunt, who was a newly appointed Supreme Court justice, controversially refused to allow Anthony to testify on her own behalf. He also directed the jury to deliver a guilty verdict, effectively denying her a trial by jury. When the verdict was announced, and before sentencing, Judge Hunt asked Anthony if she had anything to say. She seized the opportunity and delivered a scathing rebuke of the court and the denial of her rights as a citizen. She declared that her vote was not a crime, but an exercise of her citizens' rights, guaranteed by the Constitution. She stated that she would never pay a penny of the fine imposed on her, which was $100 plus court costs, and she never did. The judge deliberately did not imprison her for refusing to pay the fine, which prevented her from appealing the case to higher courts, including the Supreme Court, where she had hoped to argue the constitutional question of women's suffrage. Despite this legal setback, Anthony continued her tireless work. She traveled, constantly speaking and organizing. She helped to unite the divided suffrage movement in 1890, when the NASA and the AWSA merged to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NASA. Anthony served as its president from 1892 to 1900. She also collaborated with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and Ida Husted Harper on the monumental History of Woman Suffrage, a multi-volume work documenting the movement. Susan B. Anthony chose not to marry, believing that marriage and family responsibilities would hinder her ability to dedicate herself fully to the cause of women's rights. Her single status gave her the independence and mobility required for her demanding life as a reformer. She devoted over 50 years of her life to the struggle for equality. She lived to see some progress. By the time of her death, a few states had granted women the right to vote, and the suffrage movement had grown into a powerful national force. However, she did not live to see the passage of the federal suffrage amendment for which she had fought so long. Susan B. Anthony died on March 13, 1906, at the age of 86 in her home in Rochester, New York. Her last public words, delivered at a suffrage convention a month before her death, were, "Failure is impossible." 14 years after her death, in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified, finally granting American women the right to vote. This amendment was often referred to as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, in honor of her decades of unwavering leadership and advocacy. Susan B. Anthony's life was a testament to courage, perseverance, and an unshakable belief in justice and equality. Her refusal to accept the limitations placed on women by society and law, and her audacious act of voting when it was illegal for women to do so, made her a pivotal figure in the long fight for women's rights in America. Number 2. Florence Nightingale, the lady who revolutionized nursing. In mid-19th century Victorian England, the expectations for women of wealthy upper-class families were very clear. They were to marry well, manage a household, raise children, and engage in polite social activities. A career, especially in a field like nursing, was considered entirely unsuitable, even degrading. Nursing at that time was not a respected profession. Hospitals were often dirty, disorganized places, and nurses were typically untrained, uneducated women, sometimes with reputations for drunkenness and promiscuity. It was into this societal context that Florence Nightingale emerged, a woman who defied her family's expectations and social conventions to transform nursing into a skilled and respected profession, and to revolutionize hospital care. Florence Nightingale was born on May 12, 1820, in Florence, Italy, to a wealthy British family, William Edward Nightingale and Frances Smith. She was named after the city of her birth. Her family returned to England when she was young, and she grew up on their estates in Hampshire and Derbyshire. She received a classical education from her father, studying Greek, Latin, French, German, Italian, history, philosophy, and mathematics. She was particularly gifted in mathematics and statistics. From a young age, Florence felt a sense of calling, a desire to do something meaningful with her life beyond the conventional path laid out for women of her class. In 1837, when she was 16, she experienced what she described as a call from God to devote her life to service. Initially, she was not sure what form this service would take. Over time, her interest turned towards nursing, despite the low status of the profession and the strong opposition of her family. Her mother and sister were horrified by her ambition. They viewed nursing as work for lower-class women and believed it would bring shame upon the family. They wanted her to marry a suitable gentleman and live a comfortable, conventional life. Florence received several marriage proposals, including one from Richard Monckton Milnes, a politician and poet, whom she considered for several years. However, she ultimately rejected them, believing that marriage would interfere with her calling. She wrote in her diary that she felt her active, energetic, muscular, passionate nature quained a profession, a trade, a necessary occupation, something to fill and employ all my faculties. Despite her family's disapproval, Florence secretly pursued her interest in nursing. She read books on health and hospitals, visited hospitals in London and elsewhere, and collected information about public health. In 1850 and 1851, she managed to gain some formal nursing training at the Institute of Protestant Deaconesses in Kaiserwerth, Germany, a pioneering institution for training nurses. This experience solidified her commitment to nursing as her life's work. In 1853, she took a position as superintendent of the Institute for the Care of Sick Gentlewomen in Harley Street, London, where she impressed her employers with her efficiency and administrative skills. Her defining moment came with the outbreak of the Crimean War in 1853, in which Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire fought against Russia. Reports began to reach England of the horrific conditions in the British military hospitals in Turkey. Soldiers were dying in vast numbers, not just from battle wounds, but from diseases like cholera, dysentery, typhus, and typhoid fever, which spread rampantly in the overcrowded, unsanitary hospitals. There was a severe shortage of medical supplies, and the few nurses available were often untrained and overwhelmed. In October 1854, Sidney Herbert, the Secretary at War and a friend of the Nightingale family, asked Florence Nightingale to lead a party of nurses to the main British military hospital at Scutari, a suburb of Constantinople, now Istanbul. This was an unprecedented move, placing a woman in charge of a nursing expedition in a war zone. Nightingale quickly assembled a team of 38 nurses, carefully selected for their experience and character, and sailed for Turkey. When Nightingale and her nurses arrived at the Barrack Hospital in Scutari in November 1854, they were appalled by what they found. The hospital was located on top of a massive cesspool, which contaminated the water and the air. Patients lay on stretchers in overcrowded, filthy corridors, often still in their blood-soaked uniforms. There were rats and lice everywhere. Basic supplies, like soap, towels, bandages, and clean bedding were scarce. There was no proper kitchen, or the mortality rate was shockingly high. More soldiers were dying from disease than from their wounds. Nightingale and her team set to work immediately. She faced resistance from some army doctors and officials who were suspicious of female interference and resented her authority. However, with her strong will, administrative skills, and the backing of Sidney Herbert in London, she began to implement radical changes. She organized the nurses, established a proper kitchen to provide nutritious food for the patients, set up a laundry to provide clean linen, and procured essential supplies. She insisted on strict hygiene standards, ensuring that wards were cleaned, patients were bathed, and sanitation was improved. She established a reading room and recreational activities for convalescing soldiers. Nightingale was known for her tireless dedication. She worked long hours, often late into the night, personally tending to patients. She became famous as the Lady with the Lamp for her habit of making rounds through the dark hospital wards at night, checking on the soldiers. This image, popularized in newspapers and engravings back in England, made her a national heroine, a symbol of compassion and self-sacrifice. Beyond her hands-on nursing care, Nightingale's most significant contribution was her meticulous collection and analysis of data. She kept detailed records of mortality rates, causes of death, and the impact of sanitary reforms. She used statistics to demonstrate the link between sanitation and health outcomes. She showed, for example, that improving hygiene dramatically reduced the death rate in the Scutari hospital. Her innovative use of statistical graphics, such as the polar area diagram, a type of pie chart, was highly effective in communicating complex data to politicians and the public. By the time the Crimean War ended in 1856, Florence Nightingale had transformed the military hospitals and significantly reduced the mortality rates. She returned to England as a celebrated figure, but she shunned public adulation, preferring to work behind the scenes. She suffered from a chronic illness, possibly brucellosis, contracted during the war, which often left her bedridden for long periods. However, she continued her work with undiminished energy from her home in London. Using her fame, her connections, and her powerful evidence-based arguments, Nightingale campaigned for reforms in military and civilian healthcare. She met with Queen Victoria and government officials, presenting her findings and recommendations. Her report, Notes on Matters Affecting the Health, Efficiency and Hospital Administration of the British Army, 1858, led to the establishment of a Royal Commission on the Health of the Army, and many of her recommendations for improving sanitation, diet, and hospital design were implemented. In 1860, with funds raised in her honor, the Nightingale Fund, she established the Nightingale Training School for Nurses at St. Thomas's Hospital in London. This was the first secular nursing school in the world, and it became a model for nursing education elsewhere. It emphasized rigorous training, discipline, and high moral character for nurses, transforming nursing from a menial job into a skilled and respected profession for women. Graduates of the Nightingale School went on to establish similar training programs in Britain and other countries. Nightingale wrote extensively on nursing, hospital administration, and public health. Her book, Notes on Nursing, What It Is and What It Is Not, 1859, became a classic text, providing practical advice for nurses and for women caring for the sick at home. She also made significant contributions to hospital design, advocating for better ventilation, lighting, and sanitation. She continued to work on public health issues in India, using her statistical methods to analyze data and advocate for reforms to improve sanitation and reduce mortality rates there. Florence Nightingale never married, dedicating her life entirely to her work. Her decision to remain single allowed her the independence and focus to pursue her demanding mission. She received numerous honors, including being the first woman to be awarded the Order of Merit in 1907. She died on August 13, 1910, at the age of 90, leaving a profound legacy. She had not only saved countless lives during the Crimean War, but had also revolutionized the field of nursing, established it as a respectable profession for women, pioneered the use of statistics in public health, and laid the foundations for modern hospital administration. The Lady with the Lamp had indeed brought light to the darkest corners of healthcare. Number 1. Nikola Tesla, the electric visionary who lived for invention. At the turn of the 20th century, the world was on the cusp of an electrical revolution. Two brilliant inventors stood at the forefront of this change, but with vastly different visions and personalities. Thomas Edison, the pragmatic American entrepreneur, and Nikola Tesla, the visionary Serbian-American immigrant. Tesla, a man of extraordinary intellect and imagination, dreamed of a future powered by wireless energy and filled with incredible inventions. He chose a life of celibacy and intense focus on his work, often defying the conventional scientific and business practices of his time. Nikola Tesla was born on July 10, 1856, during a lightning storm in the village of Smiljan, in what was then the Austrian Empire, modern-day Croatia. His father was a Serbian Orthodox priest, and his mother was an inventive homemaker who created various tools and devices for domestic use. Tesla often credited his mother with inspiring his inventive spirit. From an early age, he displayed a remarkable memory, a talent for mathematics, and an intense curiosity about the natural world, particularly electricity. He studied engineering at the Austrian Polytechnic in Graz, and later at the University of Prague, though he did not complete a formal degree at either institution. In 1881, Tesla began working for a telegraph company in Budapest, where he made his first major invention, an improvement to telephone repeaters. In 1882, he moved to Paris to work for the Continental Edison Company, installing incandescent lighting systems. It was during this time, while walking in a park, that he had a flash of insight about the rotating magnetic field, a fundamental principle for alternating current, of machinery. In 1884, Tesla immigrated to the United States, arriving in New York City with little more than the clothes on his back, and a letter of introduction to Thomas Edison. Edison, already famous for inventions like the phonograph and the incandescent light bulb, was a proponent of direct current, DC, electricity. He hired Tesla to work at his laboratory. Tesla impressed Edison with his ingenuity and hard work, improving many of Edison's DC dynamos. According to Tesla, Edison offered him a substantial sum, $50,000, a fortune at the time, if he could redesign Edison's inefficient motors and generators. When Tesla successfully completed the task and asked for the promised payment, Edison allegedly dismissed it as a joke, saying, "Tesla, you don't understand our American humor." This incident, along with fundamental disagreements about the future of electricity, Tesla championed AC, while Edison was committed to DC, led to Tesla's departure from Edison's company after only about 6 months. For a time, Tesla struggled, even working as a ditch digger to survive. However, in 1887, he found financial backers and established the Tesla Electric Company. He developed and patented his polyphase A induction motor and other AC devices. These inventions were revolutionary because AC power could be transmitted efficiently over long distances, unlike DC power, which was limited to short ranges. Tesla's system caught the attention of George Westinghouse, an industrialist and inventor who was Edison's main competitor in the burgeoning electrical industry. Westinghouse recognized the superiority of ACE for widespread power distribution and licensed Tesla's patents in 1888, hiring Tesla as a consultant. This set the stage for the War of the Currents between Edison's DC system and the Westinghouse Tesla A system. Edison launched a public relations campaign to discredit A, trying to portray it as dangerous by publicly electrocuting animals with A. Despite these efforts, A's technical and economic advantages ultimately won out. The Westinghouse Electric Company, using Tesla's A technology, won the contract to illuminate the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a stunning demonstration of A's capabilities. Shortly thereafter, Westinghouse also secured the contract to build the first major hydroelectric power plant at Niagara Falls, harnessing the power of the falls to generate AC electricity, a project that realized one of Tesla's long-held dreams. Tesla was a prolific inventor during this period. He developed the Tesla coil, a high-frequency, high-voltage transformer that could produce spectacular electrical displays and was fundamental to early radio technology. He experimented with X-rays, wireless lighting, and remote control. He demonstrated a radio-controlled boat in 1898. He envisioned a world where energy and information could be transmitted wirelessly. Tesla chose to remain celibate throughout his life. He believed that romantic relationships and family life would interfere with his intense intellectual focus and scientific pursuits. He once stated, "I do not think you can name many great inventions that have been made by married men." He lived a solitary and often eccentric life, dedicated almost entirely to his work. He had meticulous habits, including a preoccupation with the number 3 and a strong aversion to germs. He was known for his impeccable dress and sophisticated manner. In 1899, Tesla moved to Colorado Springs, where he built a high-altitude experimental station. There, he conducted grounding experiments with high-voltage, high-frequency electricity. He created artificial lightning bolts many feet long, lit lamps wirelessly from a distance, and detected signals that he believed might be from extraterrestrial sources. He became convinced that he could transmit electrical power wirelessly around the globe, using the Earth itself as a conductor. With funding from financier J.P. Morgan, Tesla began construction of the Wardenclyffe Tower in Shoreham, Long Island, in 1901. This massive transmission tower was intended to be the first station in a world wireless system for broadcasting power and information globally. However, the project was plagued by financial difficulties. When Guglielmo Marconi made his famous transatlantic wireless telegraph transmission in December 1901, using some argue technology based on Tesla's earlier patents, Morgan's enthusiasm for Tesla's more ambitious and costly project waned. Morgan eventually withdrew his funding, and Wardenclyffe was never completed. The tower was later demolished. This was a devastating blow to Tesla. In the following decades, Tesla continued to generate ideas and inventions, but he struggled financially and found it increasingly difficult to secure funding for his projects. He patented numerous other devices, including a bladeless turbine. He made predictions about future technologies, many of which have since come to pass, such as radio broadcasting, television, robotics, and even something akin to savkikes and the internet. However, he became more reclusive and eccentric in his later years. He lived in a series of New York hotels, often feeding and caring for pigeons in a nearby park. He claimed to have a special bond with one particular white pigeon. Despite his immense contributions to science and technology, Tesla received relatively little financial reward or widespread public recognition during much of his later life, especially compared to figures like Edison or Marconi, with whom he had a long-standing dispute over the invention of radio. The US Supreme Court posthumously upheld Tesla's radio patent claims in 1943. Sem privatized his visionary projects over commercial success. Nikola Tesla died alone and in debt in his room at the Hotel New Yorker on January 7, 1943, at the age of 86. Much of his work and personal papers were seized by the US government's Office of Alien Property after his death, ostensibly due to his Serbian origins and the ongoing World War II, though he was a naturalized American citizen. For many years after his death, Tesla was a relatively obscure figure in popular culture, though highly respected within scientific and engineering communities. However, in recent decades, there has been a resurgence of interest in his life and work. He is now widely recognized as one of the most brilliant and visionary inventors in history, the man whose pioneering work with alternating current laid the foundation for the modern electrical grid that powers our world. His life, dedicated to the pursuit of scientific discovery and unencumbered by conventional personal or professional expectations, remains a compelling story of genius, ambition, and an unwavering commitment to a future he imagined long before it arrived.